today I'm reviewing the 2BOX DrumIt 5 Mark II module. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the Swedish brand and their DrumIt line, 2BOX was made up of previous ddrum employees and they released the first version of the DrumIt 5 all the way back in 2009. The module uses an open sound architecture and that lets you load in and play back multi-layered samples. The DrumIt 5 did have some limitations though, one of which was its reportedly shaky pad compatibility with other brands. This was mostly resolved though with the release of the DrumIt 3 module years later in 2018. This was a slightly stripped down version of the 5, but it had a new universal trigger engine which expanded its compatibility, and this new trigger engine has made its way over to the 2BOX DrumIt 5 Mark II, which began shipping in 2020. At the time of recording, in the UK it's available for around £800, in Europe it appears to be around €900, and this equates to roughly $1,000, but I'm not exactly sure where it's available from in the US, so you might need to look into that. Now, before we get into it, full disclosure, I was sent this review unit by 2BOX's UK distributor, Hand in Hand Distribution, and originally I was going to be sending it back after the review. However, slight spoilers, I wanted to buy the module off them, but instead we came to an agreement where I can keep the module in return for making some tutorials. It will become apparent as we get further into the video though that the agreement has nothing to do with this review, and all views expressed are my own opinion with no input from any outside influence. So this is an updated version of the original DrumIt 5 module with some tweaks. The most obvious is the aesthetic redesign, which I much prefer over the original version, and the front face of the module has quite a lot of buttons on it, but the ones over to the left are all for previewing or selecting pads. The main functionality comes from the right hand side of the module. In the middle is a small screen which gives Roland a bit of a run for their money. Above there are 3 function buttons and below there are 3 function knobs that can also be pressed in as buttons. The unit and kit buttons to the left are used for swapping between the 2 main menu modes, and the page up and page down buttons on the right navigate these menus. Up on the top right is the level knob which sets the overall volume for the module, but you can edit its functionality in a menu which I'll talk about later. On the back there are 10 trigger inputs: kick, snare, 4 toms and 3 cymbals, along with a hi-hat and controller input and a second input for the bell of each cymbal. Single cable 3-zone cymbals like Yamaha pads are supported through the A input, but unfortunately you can't split the B inputs off into new cymbal inputs. They're purely for supporting 3 zones over 2 cables. However, you can split the snare and tom inputs with a simple Y cable, which is really useful. I would have also quite liked to see a foot switch input on the module because that would come in handy for some functions that I'll go into later. There are 6 individual outputs that you can route the sounds through. By default, 1 and 2 are master outputs, but it is all fully configurable for different setups. Next, there's the headphone output and a line in for connecting an external audio source. Interestingly, the headphone output can actually be split and routed as an additional pair of outputs if you want to. This is a super handy feature that gives you 8 total outputs if you're happy to sacrifice onboard monitoring through the headphone socket. There are also DIN, MIDI in and out sockets along with the power port and the on and off switch. Weirdly, the USB port has been removed on this version. The original DrumIt 5 and the DrumIt 3 modules both have a USB port to let you hook it directly up to a computer and drag and drop the sounds onto it. However, those modules don't allow you to remove the SD card, whereas the Mark II has an SD card slot over on the left hand side. So you don't necessarily need the USB port since you can remove the SD card, but I do think that it would have been nice to keep it rather than having to turn the module off, take the SD card out, go over to your computer to manage the files, and then come back. The included SD card is also 32GB, which is up from the 4GB memory on the DrumIt 5 Mark I and the DrumIt 3, so that's a welcome upgrade. Before I get into the module navigation, trigger performance and stuff like that, if you're in the market for a module like this, your priority is likely to be the sounds, so we'll get straight into those. Out of the box, I think it sounds great straight away. It's loaded up with some really nice multi-layered acoustic kits, some decent electronic ones, and some pretty interesting loop-based kits. If you're used to electronic drum sets coming with really underwhelming stock kits, this module delivers a much better default standard than most of the market. Some of the stock volume settings were a little bit all over the place for my liking, and I'll get into the limitation of the module's onboard sound shaping, but they're all pretty overshadowed by the potential of being able to load any samples into the module. It's effectively a trigger to sample box, so as long as you can get the samples that are required for a particular kit, you can make it happen. Exactly how well the sounds will be played back or how they'll feel when you play them depends on a few factors. Some of it is just down to the performance of the triggers, but a large part of it relies on the sample pool. For example, if the samples are trimmed badly with a bit of silence before the sound starts, they'll feel laggy and they'll play badly. If you're loading an instrument that only has a few dynamic layers, you can expect much more machine gunning and less than stellar dynamics. But the DrumIt 5's DSND file format supports up to 127 samples per zone, so you can make sure that there's enough dynamic and tonal variation to make these sounds play and feel natural. So in order to get your sounds into the module, they need to be in 2BOX's own DSND format and placed on the SD card. There are a bunch of free sounds available to download from the 2BOX website, so that's a great first place to look. But when you're ready to use your own samples, there's a simple 2BOX DrumIt editor program that you can use to create the DSND files and also edit kit files with. You simply put your SD card into your computer's reader, open the editor, go to the sound option, choose your instrument type, then navigate to a folder and drag and drop the samples into the correct zone assignment. The software will automatically assign all of the samples to a velocity based on their perceived loudness. This method works well, and I've not noticed any major hiccups with any of the assignments of the samples that I've tried so far. Personally, I would like it if there was a little bit more flexibility, maybe with the option to choose your own sample distribution if you want to, but to be fair, it's not really been necessary so far, and generally speaking, if your samples are already well distributed across the dynamic range, then this software will handle it really well. I will be releasing a tutorial video for the software in the near future, so I'll be going into more depth for every instrument type in that video. Slightly annoyingly, you can't edit any instruments that you've already made with this software. You'll need to adjust things at the sample level, then create a new file with the new settings based on those tweaks. If you swap over to kit mode, you can build your kit bank files in there and assign any sounds from your SD card to any pad or zone. Again, the kit editor is a little bit rudimentary, but making changes with this editor can be a lot quicker than dialing it all in on the module. There are also alternative pieces of software available with more flexibility that personally I think are worth investing in, but they're absolutely not necessary to get going, so maybe that's another future video. So here are some examples of different kits made up of a range of different samples from various sources. Needless to say, the included sounds are impressive and it handles imported sounds really well too. You're only really limited by your sample pool, your imagination, or your desire to spend time on the technical ins and outs. In other regards though, there are a few limitations to consider. The first is that whatever samples you want to use need to be pre-mixed. The WAV files that you use will be bounces in either mono or stereo, and they're going to include whatever microphone configuration, processing or ambience that you choose before you export them. And really, this is a pretty small overall criticism that won't make a noticeably huge difference for a lot of people. Next is that there have been various reports over the years of sample quality degradation when importing sounds into the DrumIt modules. According to an old forum post, when you choose to give the sample a tuning range, the audio is encoded with a matching lower sample rate to allow for the tuning to be applied on playback. If you don't think that you'll want the ability to tune the sounds up in the box, the best thing to do is to either keep the max tune low or turn it off altogether. This should then keep the sample rate higher, and you can actually still tune things down with the max tune set to 0, you just can't tune them up. I personally feel like, yes, there is a difference when you play the sound in the module versus using the VST, but it's far more than usable for the majority of situations, and I have noticed a better audio quality when you turn off the max tune setting. You'll probably get better results applying the tuning in your software or DAW before you export it, and then create different files for tunings that you like. The other limitations to the sounds are the lack of decent onboard effects. Besides the EQ, there are only echo or delay and a flanger. These really aren't the most useful effects for acoustic style drums. Reverb is the most obvious, and it's a real shame that that wasn't included to begin with or added for the updated Mark II module. Reverb or big ambience baked into the samples can work, but it's not quite as natural or free-flowing as running the sounds through a reverb effect that's reacting to the samples in real time. Compression would also be a very useful effect to have. Again, it's something you can technically add in at the sample level, but generally speaking, when the effect is being applied in real time to the samples as you play, the results feel a lot different. I can only really assume that the included effects were chosen based on being easy to implement directly with the samples, rather than using a proper dedicated effects processor. Now, not having more effects isn't the be-all and end-all, but choosing not to add more capabilities to the updated version of a decade-old module is a bit of a missed trick in my opinion. The EQ is a little bit more limited than on some other modules as well. Each kit has access to one EQ setting that's got 3 bands. This is a pretty basic setup, and by default all of the sounds are routed through it, but you can choose to route only certain pads if you want. So that does make it a little bit more flexible, but it's never going to be as customizable as an EQ per instrument, or even just a few EQs for different buses. So do these limitations stop the sounds from being usable or make the module bad? No, the weight of the benefits is still greater in my opinion, but this re-release could have been a good opportunity for improvement. You do have to weigh up what it can do with its price point and competition though, and on that front, it's still doing very well for itself. The trigger performance with the module has been mostly good, but when I first set it up, it did take me a little while to get some of the pads dialed in. As a general rule, you'll probably have an easier time getting good results from a pad from a major brand. I started off with converted pads using drone triggers, a Geardrum 3CS trigger, and a few DIY pads, and this meant that I had to get really familiar with some of the settings. Early on, I was getting rim triggering on the head zones almost constantly, even with the correct pad PP or piezo trigger setting, and most mesh pads use that kind of trigger setup. The main thing that I learned to keep in mind is that the module kind of handles the head and the rim triggering separately. When compared to other modules, it's almost like you're dialing in two pads and balancing between them. This led me to two settings that I've not seen on other modules, the X-Trig and X-Adjust settings. These are basically zone crosstalk settings for getting better separation between the head and the rim zones. By default, these were off, and it seems that that's what was causing the problems with these pads. There are also high pass and low pass options for these settings, and that really helped get the rim triggering more accurate on certain pads. I just spent a bit of time experimenting to find the best settings, but once I had it right, I got great head and rim separation. This was even the case with some of the Roland pads that I tried too. I've got a PD-128 and a PDA-120L. I expected that they'd just work off the bat with a Roland style preset, but I still had to dive into those rim settings again. However, with a little bit of tweaking, I got great results. When it comes to cymbals, my Roland and ATV ones were really easy to get going with 3 zones and 2 cables with the appropriate trigger settings. Having 3 zones on all of the cymbal inputs, by the way, is great, and I think that it's something that every module should have as a standard these days. Bow, edge and bell sensitivity worked really well once I'd set them up, and of course you get choking as well. My lemon cymbals worked well with the 2 cable setup using the Roland style settings. The results that I've had with my Yamaha cymbals has been a little bit mixed. I've had no issues using my PCY135 as a 2-zone hi-hat. When I plugged in my new Yamaha PCY175 as a 3-zone pad with 1 cable using the CY-PSY preset for Yamaha cymbals, I was often getting random edge triggering on the bow and the bell zones. It seems to happen most consistently if I hit hard right where the bell and the bow meet. At first I thought that maybe my pad was faulty, but it worked fine on my Mimic Pro, and then I noticed that it does the same if I plug in my 135 as a 3-zone ride. After some discussion with 2BOX, they concluded that there might be some further testing to do, and improvements to be made, and it's probably most likely related to some impedance settings. Hopefully it can be resolved in a future update. The hi-hat pedal calibration is a pretty simple affair, and the module supports a few different kinds of hi-hat controller. Within a few button presses you can set up the open and close position and then adjust other settings to fine-tune the response, such as the threshold and calibration range, the pedal sensitivity and the pedal response curve. I've had pretty decent results with both my Roland FD7 pedal and my drum controller. So unfortunately not every single trigger is perfect, but it has handled some of my trickier triggers better than I expected once I understood how the trigger settings interacted. A large amount of pads are supported well, especially if you have more stock pad setups, but you probably shouldn't expect instant results. It's a real shame about the Yamaha cymbals because it's a small mar on an otherwise well-performing trigger engine. As mentioned earlier, there are two main modes. The module starts up on the program screen of the kit mode where you can swap between kits, play or stop the onboard metronome or song player, and save a kit if you've made any changes. As you navigate down, everything from here is kit or sound related. If you swap over to unit mode, this is where you'll make the changes to the overall module settings. I was a little bit unsure about the menu structure when I first used it, but it's actually pretty logically laid out, and everything is only ever up or down from where you are in each mode. I've already talked about some of the sound settings, but now I'll highlight some features which are particularly useful, then a few things that I wish were improved upon or included. In kit mode, there's more flexibility to some of the sound assignment options than you might expect. On the envelope page, the top left setting lets you choose which zones play which samples. It can be all zones playing their respective samples, or you can disable different ones. If you've split a pad or assigned different sounds to each zone, this setting lets you cycle between the articulations that are played by each zone. You can also use the layer parameter to choose how the samples are chosen for given velocities. The VAR function is usually the default, and this will pick from different samples from around the velocity range that you're playing, giving you that more realistic round-robin effect. The top setting will always play back the top velocity level for that sound. And fix will always play back the exact sample that's assigned to the velocity of your hit, rather than swapping between the ones around it. I personally always enjoy being given control of things like this for creative uses, and having it saved on a per kit basis means that the same samples can be used in different ways for different kits. The hi-hat position function on the KFNC screen is handy if you want to set your hi-hat to a specific level of openness for a particular kit. Unfortunately though, you can't set this parameter up on the pad function screen, which I think is a little bit of a missed trick. Being able to hit a pad to lock your hi-hat and then hit it again to resume pedal control would be really useful, and it's possible on some other modules. And as I mentioned earlier, it's also a shame that there isn't a foot switch input on the module. Having a dedicated switch for functions rather than using a pad input is far better in my opinion. You can assign any sound that you want to the metronome, which is great, and what I think's really useful is that of course you could create your own custom metronome DSND file just for this function if you want to. The ability to assign a song to a kit is really handy for play-alongs or for running backing tracks, and it's something I've wished for on other modules. It's a shame that you've got to choose between a track or a metronome, but there are ways around it. If you pan your track to one side and the click track to the other, you can use one of the routing settings to send these out of separate outputs, or to not send the click track out at all. Speaking of, the output routing in general is surprisingly flexible. It takes a little bit of getting used to the different icons on this little screen, but you can set up many configurations through different buses and the direct outputs. The manual is really helpful with this too, and it explains different scenarios and how to route for all of them. As I mentioned earlier, by default the volume knob on the front panel controls both the headphones and the master outputs. But if you do dive into the menus, you can swap the out 1 and 2 setting from the mix option to the mix exclamation mark option, which uncouples these outputs from the knob. You can save multiple .dkit bank files with 100 kits in each, and then choose which of them to boot when you're turning the module on by holding a button combination. This is way more flexible and quicker than some modules where you might need to save or load full backups, which can take time, and you can keep many configurations on your SD card to swap between them. One thing I'm not a big fan of is how the snare and tom channels are locked for certain trigger types. If, for example, you want to get rid of a tom and replace it with a cymbal, you can't access the cymbal trigger pad types on the tom inputs. Now, depending on your pads, there's a chance that you could make it work by fudging the settings and changing the sounds, but you still wouldn't get cymbal chokes. Considering that there are only 3 dedicated cymbal inputs on the module if you ignore the hi-hat, this is a little bit of a limitation for changing up your setup. I also feel like they've missed a trick by not making the kick input splittable for an extra zone. That would have been really nice. I know that Yamaha allow this, but to be fair, most other manufacturers don't, so I suppose it's not really something I can solely blame 2BOX for. Now, one thing that is very annoying and can cause a few issues is that playback lags at times when you're on different menu screens. This can be really jarring when you're trying to dial in your triggers or if you just forget to leave a menu after tweaking some settings. The only fully stable area seems to be the main drum kit screen, so you have to make sure that you go back to that to play. It's not a complete deal breaker, but it's really not ideal and it can cause a lot of interruptions to your playing experience. The third zone for the snare, the cross stick zone, is only accessible using a 3-zone piezo switch pad like the Yamaha TCS snares. Unfortunately, when you're using a piezo pad, the module can't detect true rim shots and distinguish between those and a standard rim hit like Roland modules, the MKII Pro and the eDrum In can. This is a bit of a shame, you just get one kind of rim articulation on those pads when you're using the DrumIt 5 module. But I guess then it does follow that you can't access the third articulation on those particular pads. However, you also can't access the cross-stick zone when you're sending MIDI into the module. There's no dedicated MIDI note for it. This is a bit of a waste really, because the samples are already in the DSND files, I just can't use them without those specific pads. I have been told that hopefully this will make its way into a software update, so fingers crossed. I also find the hi-hat chicks to be a little bit weird. There's just one set of samples for both of the pedal articulations, so you assign a foot splash sound and the speed at which you release the pedal is what determines the sound that comes out. It basically just shortens the decay on this sample when you close the pedal to create the foot chick. So in theory this works because the downward pedal hit has mostly the same sound whether you release it for a splash or not. In practice though, it sometimes leads to quite empty sounding hi-hat chicks rather than a nice solid feeling one. To be honest, it really depends on the samples that you have. There are a few instruments where the very beginning of a foot splash creeps through. So the DrumIt 5 Mark II is not without its faults, but if you're looking for what the module does right, loading full multi-layered instruments directly into the module, largely good pad compatibility across numerous brands, and some of the best output routing options for its price range, most of the downsides are pretty easy to overlook. The DrumIt 5 has a lot going for it, and it does cater to a lot of people out of the box thanks to its good onboard sounds and flexibility, but it will mostly appeal to those people who want to use the multi-layered sample functions, don't mind spending some time tweaking things and experimenting, or putting in a bit of effort to get exactly what they're looking for. So if you think that it ticks the right boxes for you, I do highly recommend it. In its current price range and even above, nothing else can really do what it does to the same level. The closest you can really get at the moment around this price point is the Alesis Strike module and maybe the Yamaha DTX-PRO. The Alesis Strike competes pretty well in terms of multi-layered sample support and output routing options, and it has an abundance of features that the DrumIt 5 doesn't have, but the Strike does have quite a few problems on its own, and you do need to weigh the two modules up on their own merits because they're not really the same. The Yamaha DTX-PRO 2 is really well priced, and it also lets you load multi-layered samples, but the process for loading them seems pretty arduous and you don't get much sample memory to work with. It also doesn't have multiple outputs like the DrumIt 5 does. As far as the Mark II version goes specifically, I feel like that's a little bit of a mixed bag. There are some really welcome improvements over the original module as far as I can tell, but I do think that this is a little bit of a bare bones update. However, the bones that were already there were strong to begin with. I really do have to commend the DrumIt 5 for still being relevant in the market despite over a decade's worth of competition releasing since the first version launched. As far as continued support goes, during the course of this review I was sent a beta version of a software update which had 1 or 2 new functions, and I've been assured that some of the things discussed in this review video will be making their way into future updates. So I'm optimistic about some of the issues being resolved, though we will have to wait and see when that arrives. So what do you think? Is this module for you? I'll be releasing some tutorial videos for things like loading instruments soon, so make sure that you're subscribed if you want to see those. I'll also be releasing some instruments of my own in the near future, which I'm really excited about for the module, so keep an eye on my store at thedrumworkshop.com for more on that. But above all, enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!